Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into the incredible, microscopic, chronological journey of how plants reproduce, transforming some pretty complex biology into a clear visual adventure. And since I know a bunch of you watching are actively prepping for exams, I'm going to weave in exactly 10 crucial biology revision tips directly from our source guides along the way to make sure you avoid the most common pitfalls. Let's get started. We're breaking this explainer down into 4 main phases: anatomy of a flower, pollination, wind versus insect, the fertilization process, and finally, seeds, fruits, and genetics.
Phase 1, anatomy of a flower. Let's map the terrain.
Okay, so let's start with the flower itself. We usually just think of them as nice decorations, right? But biologically speaking, the flower is the plant's actual reproductive organ, completely engineered to ensure the survival of its species. To set the stage, we really need to distinctly separate the male parts, which make the pollen, from the female parts, which house the egg. The male part is collectively called the stamen. That's made up of a filament holding up the pollen-producing anther. The female part is the carpel. Think of it like a pathway. It starts up top with the stigma, travels down a stalk called the style, and ends at the ovary at the base, which safely tucks away the ovules. Now here's revision tip 1. When you're labeling a diagram, always draw your line to the specific structure, not just a broad bracket. It makes a difference. And revision tip 2, an easy trick to remember the male part, just look at the word itself, stamen. Moving on to phase 2, pollination, wind versus insect. Now that we've got the map down, how do plants actually find a mate when they're, literally rooted to the ground? Well, that's a process called pollination. Simply put, pollination is just the transfer of pollen grains from the male anther to the female stigma. Plants came up with 2 main evolutionary workarounds to bridge this physical gap. They either rely on the breeze to carry lightweight pollen, or they bribe insects with sweet nectar to carry sticky pollen for them. It's a classic case of form perfectly matching function. Insect-pollinated flowers pour massive amounts of energy into bright petals and sweet scents to attract pollinators, and their pollen is inherently sticky or spiky, so it grabs onto the insect's body. Wind-pollinated plants, on the flip side, don't waste energy on looking good or smelling sweet. Their petals are dull, but they produce massive amounts of very light, smooth pollen that easily catches the wind. Which brings us to revision tip 3. Whenever you are studying plant reproduction, always explicitly link a physical feature back to its specific evolutionary function, like, say, spiky pollen for gripping insect fur. Take a wind-pollinated flower, for example. You can clearly see the stamens swinging loosely on long filaments totally outside the flower. This ensures the anthers can release pollen grains easily into the breeze. And look at the stigmas. They're feathery and also hang out there to act like a net, catching any drifting pollen grains. It's completely a game of numbers and aerodynamics. So here is revision tip 4. In exam diagrams, if the anthers and stigmas hang completely outside the petals, it is almost definitely a wind-pollinated plant. Let's test this logic visually. Based on what we just talked about regarding sticky versus light pollen, try to spot the ones here under a microscope that are meant to hitch a ride on a bug. Well, if you guessed numbers 1 and 2, you are absolutely correct. You can clearly see those spikes and hooks on their outer surfaces. Those adaptations are what allow them to firmly attach to the fur or legs of visiting insects, unlike the smooth grains in number 3, which are perfectly streamlined to just be blown by the wind. Here is revision tip 5. Being able to quickly compare and contrast these specific physical adaptations under a microscope is an absolute goldmine for picking up easy marks on multiple choice questions. All right, phase 3, the fertilization process. Let's see how this builds, because honestly, a pollen grain successfully landing on a stigma is only half the battle. This is where the real microscopic magic happens. And this brings us to revision tip 6, probably the most absolutely crucial one in our entire explainer. Students constantly confuse pollination with fertilization. Think of pollination as just delivering the mail to the front door. Fertilization requires the male nucleus to actually travel inside the house and fuse with a female egg. Literally, if you only remember one distinction today, make it this one. So how does it get inside? Since the pollen grain doesn't have a tail to swim to the ovary like human sperm does, it has to engineer its own path. Once the grain lands on the correct same-species stigma, it starts to secrete enzymes. And these enzymes literally digest a microscopic tunnel, the pollen tube, all the way down the style. The male nucleus slips down this newly formed tube, traveling purposefully towards the ovary, which holds the ovules. Revision tip 7, commit this exact pathway to memory. Stigma, down the style,
and into the ovary. Sequencing questions absolutely love asking for this exact journey.
And here is the exact moment of fertilization mapped out. The pollen tube enters the ovule, usually through a tiny hole called the micropyle. And bam, right there, the haploid male pollen nucleus meets the haploid female egg nucleus. They fuse together to form a diploid zygote, a single cell with a full set of chromosomes. For those of you writing extended answers, here is revision tip 8. Always clearly state the phrase fusion of nuclei when describing fertilization. Just writing the pollen meets the egg won't get you full marks.
Finally, Phase 4, Seeds, Fruits, and Genetics. We've reached the final resolution. We're going to explore what happens to the flower anatomy once fertilization is successfully completed. Basically, the flower's job is mostly done, and the plant undergoes this radical physical transformation. The newly formed zygote starts to divide, eventually forming a seed within the ovule. The ovule wall develops into a hard coat to protect it. Meanwhile, the surrounding ovary, which houses all these newly formed seeds, swells right up and becomes the fruit. So, biologically speaking, that apple or tomato you eat, it's actually a swollen plant ovary. Crazy, right? Okay, revision tip 9. Don't swap the words ovule and ovary. Just remember, the slightly smaller word, ovule, becomes the seed, and the larger structure, ovary, becomes the fruit. To wrap up the logic of everything we've just learned, this comparison perfectly highlights the grand evolutionary trade-off of plant reproduction. What we just walked through was sexual reproduction. It's incredibly hard work, it's slow, takes a lot of energy to make those petals and nectar, and carries the massive risk of relying entirely on pollinators. However, because two parents are involved, it creates absolutely vital genetic diversity. This means if a new disease arrives, some offspring might actually have the genes to survive. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, is lightning fast and needs only one parent, but it creates identical clones. That lack of variation leaves the entire population highly vulnerable if environmental conditions change. To really master this topic, here is your final tip. Revision tip 10. Create your own comparison tables exactly like this one to summarize the grand evolutionary trade-offs between sexual and asexual reproduction. I'll leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. As we see bee and insect populations drop in globally, the very system of sexual reproduction we've explored today is under serious threat. Think about it. If plants can't cross-pollinate, they lose their genetic variety, and we lose the swollen ovaries we rely on for food. It's a delicate balance that affects every ecosystem on Earth. Well, I hope this structured journey has completely transformed your understanding of plant reproduction. And for those of you studying, I hope these 10 integrated revision tips give you a serious edge. Keep learning and keep observing the natural world around you.